Welcome to today's World Affairs program. I'm Ray Suarez. I'm the host of On Shifting Ground, which is produced by World Affairs, aired locally here on KQED, and delivered everywhere else on planet Earth via podcast. World Affairs is a San Francisco-based nonprofit, a nonpartisan forum that explores international issues and ideas beyond borders in all their nuance and complexity. If you want to hear a journalist lament the state of affairs in the news business, that's easy. You only have to ask them, and you'll get an earful. But that's been true for decades. But now a convergence of unavoidable and unpredictable factors, crisis in the business model, rapid technological change, and the rising distrust of institutions have combined to create a crisis that threatens far more than whether reporters are happy with their work conditions or feel like they're being paid fairly. Nothing less than the future of information, the future of social trust, and the future of democracy is at stake. The Dominion versus Fox News case is over, and instead of hearing public testimony from people who lied to their local loyal viewers, it ended with a cash settlement. Dominion's lawyer says the end of the case is significant anyway. In a news conference on the courthouse steps, he said, "For our democracy to endure another 250 years, hopefully much longer, we must share a commitment to facts. Misinformation will not go away. It may only get worse." In countries where journalists work in fear of arrest or physical harm, in countries where elites have long used their money and their power to control what the public knows, the situation is even more threatening. Look at what the Russian public hears about the war in Ukraine. Add to the sheer muscle and threat the technological means to spread lies, convince the public that up is down and black is white, and today, just a generation since democracies and the free press took a victory lap at the end of the Cold War, and triumphalists noted that hundreds of millions more people were now living under freely elected governments with a free press, there are now, once again, clouds on the horizon. To its tremendous credit, the BBC now has a disinformation unit, and we're going to hear a lot more about it. I'm here with a cohort of 10 professional journalists from around the world who are fellows at the World Press Institute for immersion in the governance, politics, business, media, journalistic ethics, and culture of the U.S. The World Press Institute was established in 1961 to strengthen and promote the founding principles and best practices of journalism in the U.S. and around the world that lead to transparency and accountability of the government and the private sectors. Our guest, Fauziyya Tukur, is a senior journalist in that BBC unit. She's based in Abuja, Nigeria. We're going to talk about the critical work she's doing in a country that will have a lot to say about the future direction of Africa, not only as the largest population on the continent, but a country with a great deal of cultural clout on that vast continent. Fauziyya, welcome to World Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, where to begin? I mean, the problems are so vast and will take a lot more than the efforts of just one institution, one set of initiatives to root out disinformation. Where have you been training your attention lately?
So before I say anything, I would like to say that whatever I say today are my views and do not represent the views of the BBC. And to answer your question, I have been working, like you said, in Nigeria, focusing on disinformation in Nigeria, but most importantly, disinformation spread online in Nigeria.
And particularly in the political sphere, the cultural sphere, what gets people going in Nigeria? What is there an incentive? If you want to stir the pot, if you want to raise the temperature, what do you inject into society's bloodstream in your country?
Well, first of all, Nigeria is a very diverse country. We have over 200 ethnicities, and it's a very, very religious country. You have the predominant South and the predominantly Christian South and the predominantly Muslim North. So that kind of governs whatever happens in Nigeria, political-wise, social-wise. And then our constitution, to some extent, is, governed by those religious, undertones, religious laws. And for anything to work well in Nigeria, religion has to be put into consideration. So when it comes to political appointments, when it comes to division of resources, all of that. So disinformation is in Nigeria, of course, follows that trend. So because of the polarization, when it comes to religion, that Christian-Muslim division, we see a lot of the use of emotive language, labeling, loaded language that alludes to religion, that alludes to ethnicity, that alludes to regionality or regionalism, if there's a word like that. And for example, in this election cycle, what we saw is, a lot of, or so to say, an information overload where we see both sides using those loaded language, pitting one side against the other. And, the ruling party is, our president is Muslim, his vice president is Christian. But then the elections came and the ruling party nominated a Muslim presidential candidate and a Muslim vice presidential candidate. And that kind of stirred the pot of, religion and intolerance, which is very common in Nigeria. And before you know it, social media in Nigeria was rife with a lot of disinformation, a lot of false information, narratives, false narratives about the ruling party trying to Islamize the whole country, trying to marginalize the predominantly Southern Christian region. And, that was just the dominant narrative. Everything that was discussed around that. We were not hearing conversations about what the presidential candidates were going to do when they're elected. Nobody was paying attention to the blueprint of the presidential candidates. Nobody was paying attention to, what work they intend to do in terms of inflation, which is a major problem in the country. In terms of security, Nigeria is dealing with a lot of insecurity, kidnappings, extremism, religious extremism, Boko Haram, all of that. Nobody was talking about development of infrastructure. The whole narrative, the whole discussion on social media was tilted towards that polarization.
So somebody had an interest in the national conversation being about religion and ethnicity and regionalism rather than those issues. Did
Absolutely.
they win? Did they succeed in their effort to turn up the temperature and distract the voters of the country?
Oh, yes. The elections came with a lot of problems. We saw a lot of violence, ballot snatching, killings, arson, and I wouldn't say for sure if all of these that happened were fueled by what people saw online, but I mean, that was the only conversation that was going on. I can't say for sure if someone saw a message being posted by someone, but we saw people. And important to say is that in Nigeria, social media influencers are an important aspect of the media. Just as someone would listen to the radio or read the newspaper, social media influencers play a huge part. And we saw a lot of them doing that, fueling hate speech. We saw a lot of them just pushing narratives that were totally untrue and that were inciting. Actually, at a point, we saw social media influencers linking a presidential candidate to a terrorist organization. That's a very touchy subject anywhere in the world. And then we've seen social media influencers fabricating a story about, presidential candidate that was from a certain region, being, I don't know how to put this now, part of a drug cartel with no evidence of that. So the results of the election, the election itself, before we get to the results, the election itself was marred by a lot of inconsistencies because of the violence, of course, that happened during the election. And then during the election, we saw, the spread of misinformation about the Electoral Commission itself. People saying it has been compromised, by certain presidential candidates, and they let the server, there's the server where the election result is being collated, to be rigged and manipulated. And people believed that.
If people, for their own reasons, start to circulate information like this connection to a drug cartel or this association with a terrorist organization, is it sufficient for the national press, big newspapers, broadcasters in the most spoken regional languages, to get on and say, that's not true? Is that ever sufficient to put the fire out?
No, it's not. And the thing is, we have this saturation of microblogs, as they are called back home. Everyone is starting a news blog these days, whether a journalist or not. They just pick on information they see anywhere. They go on social media, they see a message or a narrative that is being pushed, and it goes in their site. And before you know it, it's been spread all over. It goes on WhatsApp, it goes in text. But then it's sad that it also spills offline. Not many people are on social media, but then the few that are, not the few, but the ones that are, go to people that are not on social media and tell them, look, I saw this on social media. It appears so and so person was part of a drug gang or whatever. And then he tells the next person, and he tells the next person. And before you know it, it's the dominant narrative that everyone is talking about. And I think, with going back to your question about, big newspapers or sites reporting on that, because there is that polarization, there are media organizations that are seen as belonging to a certain party or a certain region or a certain religion. People from the other side will not believe what they see. So there is that mistrust, of the media. And we still listen to the radio a lot. Everyone in the morning is listening to the radio, whether in their car or on the phone. And you see radio stations picking up those false narratives that are on social media and making them the topic of discussion on their programs, and letting people call in, like phone-in programs, call in to say what they think about the topics. And that's how...
And that reinforces the original story.
It reinforces the original story, and it spreads and spreads and spreads. And before you know it, it's all over, and everyone believes it's true.
So you have the problem, the challenge, not only of the original bad actor who is spreading malicious and false news, but thousands of willing co-conspirators who hand it on.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's actually deliberate, from the actual spreaders, the actual people that fabricated the story. It's a deliberate tactic to amplify it, to make it go viral, not just on social media, but, all over the country. So I did an investigation, and I spoke to a whistleblower who is part of this ecosystem of a disinformation campaign. And what they told me is, it's a strategy that they use. They implant people in Nigeria in religious settings, in the community, where people gather, just to push that narrative, because that is their aim, that is their motivation. And they actually have media companies that are compromised, that are willing to receive money to do that for them.
Are you really in an uphill battle, in part because of the algorithms? You already said that just going on national radio or national television or into the national newspapers and saying what the truth is, well, that doesn't work, and that's too late. Mm-hmm. You talked about all the people who are planted to hand on malicious information. We already know from neurology that information that gets there first is harder to dislodge, even if it's false. You can tell people 10 times actual facts after they've already heard false information, and they will still believe the false information. Given all of that, what can you do? I mean, just the fact that you work on a disinformation unit tells me that you haven't just thrown up your hands and given up. What are the tools in pushing back?
I've had this conversation with my colleague Saqib from Pakistan, and he's of the idea that disinformation is not, fact-checking disinformation is not a journalist's job, which I agree with him to some extent.
Oh, tell me more. Why would you say that? When I think a lot of reporters would think, well, fact-checking is what I do for a living. Mm-hmm. Why are you saying that's not a journalist's job?
Because with disinformation, it's much more than fact-checking. Disinformation campaigns are very coordinated, they're very organized, systemic, they're very sophisticated. And unraveling them is, I agree, unraveling disinformation campaigns, are more or less a journalistic, skill. But when it comes to other aspects of disinformation, misinformation, the spread of false information on social media, we all have a collective responsibility to educate ourselves on how to spot them. You can't just receive something on your phone and say, oh, this is true because it's on my phone. We have a collective responsibility to educate ourselves on how to spot what is real and what is fake. We have to be skeptic of whatever it is that we see and not just be overly, believing of whatever we see. But going back to, what you said about algorithm, and that is one of the major challenges, and that is one of the reasons why disinformation and misinformation spread like wildfire on social media, because social media platforms are designed to read the character of a user. So the more you engage with the content, the more you see that content or similar content or content from that user or content from the person sending that message or posting that message. And that's why when you begin to receive messages from, disinformation actors, people that spread disinformation, or people that use certain words or certain sentences used in the spread of disinformation, you engage with it, you spend some time reading it, your algorithm notices that, you like it, your algorithm notices that, you retweet it, you share it, your algorithm notices that, and it begins to show you more and more and more of that message or that kind of message or message from that particular person or message from the people that that person engages with. So before you know it, it's an echo chamber, and all you get is messages that, are full of disinformation, full of misinformation, or tilting you towards that. And that's all you see, and the more you see, the more you believe, the more you engage, and that's the aim.
Oh, well, I guess that's it. You can all go home, folks. We're cooked. There's got to be a way to confront these forces who have developed these tools not necessarily to deceive the world, Mark Zuckerberg didn't sit down and figure out a way to make people believe falsehoods. He wants people who want to sell sneakers or computers to keep getting their ads in front of people who want to buy different things. But the tools of selling sneakers are now selling ideas. Are the platforms helping? Are the platforms taking this threat seriously and saying, okay, we understand that we're part of creating this problem?
They are to some extent, but I would say they can do more. There's a need for more work to be done in terms of fishing out disinformation campaigns, moderation, and one problem that we have seen in Nigeria is how, the people that spread disinformation, misinformation, are able to bypass, moderation on social media platforms using local languages, which I think social media platforms are not investing a lot in. They've also been able to bypass moderation through using their own fabricated languages. So they have, because they know they have a target audience, sometimes they're able to use certain words that their audience will understand, but Facebook might not understand, Twitter might not understand. So I think they are to some extent, but more needs to be done. Just recently, the only Twitter office in Africa, in Ghana, was shut down. And I know that's going to really affect moderation on the continent.
It is an amazing thing to say, to hear somebody say, the only office in Africa was shut down. Over 1 billion people, more than 50 countries, and they said, well, we're going to shut that down. Meta is doing another big layoff now. Twitter has done an enormous layoff. Facebook has recently done big layoffs, even at a time when we know communal strife in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, has been driven by social media platforms. The efforts to target Rohingyas in Burma, in Myanmar, have been directed by campaigns on social media, particularly Facebook in that case. And Mark Zuckerberg said, look, we can't hire enough people who speak Burmese to stay on top of this. They get ahead of us and we can't catch up. It would seem to be a problem that bad actors, they're ahead. They're winning right now.
So they need to do more. Social media platforms need to do more in terms of moderation.
Do you think they will?
I don't know.
As a skeptical observer of the scene and as a reporter immersed in the disinformation industry, do you really think they will?
I don't know, to be honest, but I think they need to be on their toes, because I feel like social media platforms do not see disinformation, the spread of misinformation, as a big threat as we journalists see it, possibly. But I would say that more needs to be done.
The people who are doing this stuff have really gone to school on human nature. They understand what lights people up. They understand what gets them angry and hot. They understand the visual coding. They understand the use of hot language. Is this an opportunity for machine learning? Is this an opportunity for robots? If you can't hire enough Burmese speakers, maybe you can teach robots how to figure this stuff out.
Well, yeah, artificial intelligence is really evolving, and we're seeing how disinformation actors are using it to their advantage. We're seeing AI generating voices, AI generating videos, AI generating very, very believable photos. it's not an optimistic situation all in all. I would say generative AI can do so much more than we can imagine. And this is to the advantage of, the disinformation atmosphere.
See, I asked you for a little hope and optimism on the artificial intelligence front, and you gave me more examples of how AI can be used for nefarious purposes. You're not helping me out here.
That's because I'm not very optimistic about the situation.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, in as much as AI is being used to do damage, harm, I think it can also be used in a good way. It has its positives and its negatives, like almost anything. Generative AI, like it's used to fabricate photos, videos, audios, can also be used to debunk these these campaigns. You can use artificial intelligence to map out and actually contextualize disinformation campaigns. There are tools that do that. There are tools that tell you how the actors in a disinformation campaign are all linked up online. There is AI that can tell you how a disinformation campaign originated or where it originated from. So, it's for both sides.
We have a presidential, you may have heard, we have a presidential election in this country next year. It feels like we're still coming down from the last one, so I can't believe there's another one any minute now. But do you anticipate that we'll see some of the same tactics field tested in Nigeria in their recent elections in ours? Do we have some of the same ingredients on the social landscape? High levels of polarization, high levels of religious identification that makes us as a people not only prone to this kind of exploitation, but also should serve as a warning that we shouldn't be too smug and paternalistic about, oh, those people other places in the world who believe this nonsense. We have a disinformation problem right here in this country.
Oh, yes. Just the way Nigeria is highly polarized, America is the same. It is very, very much polarized. In fact, when I hear the word polarize, the United States is the first thing that comes to mind. So, yes, I mean, you would think that a country like Nigeria, that is a young democracy, is prone to these issues, and then developed democracies like the United States might not see these issues, but that's totally not true. That's false, because with misinformation and especially political disinformation, a lot of people, even the very educated people, are prone to falling victim. You would think that because one is well educated, they've been to school, they are exposed, so to say, they would be able to tell when something is true or not, but that's not the case. Peddlers of disinformation are very smart. They do it in such a way that you would breeze through a completely false story and you wouldn't even know. But then when you think of all the things that have been happening in the United States in the past years, you would understand what I mean when I say, it's very, very much very close to everyone. And I would ask Americans to be very skeptical, to be on their toes, to educate themselves. And then for journalists here, media literacy is very important, so that when people go online, they're able to make informed decisions about what they engage with, what they believe in.
It's funny. The platforms tried to incorporate fact-checking and checking of sources, checking of verifiability into the processing of posts. Mm-hmm. Someone would pick up the link for an article that appealed to them or something they read. If they want to put it in their feed, they'll put it in their feed. But it'll automatically generate a warning underneath, a black box that says, be careful of content from this source, or the things that are said in this story are simply not true. Instead of taking that to heart, a large number of Americans recoiled from that effort and said that the people putting that information in the black box were biased. Because if the tilt of the story didn't agree with their already existing beliefs,
Yeah.
they would say, well, it's not the story that's biased, it's not the headline that's unfair or miscast, it's the effort to warn me about it that actually is the bad actor here. It doesn't give you a lot of faith in human nature, but it also makes you wonder how good information can go to battle against bad.
Absolutely.
It feels like the toolbox is limited.
It is, and we're seeing a lot of people now go into alternative social media, because they kind of have lost hope in the traditional social media or the well-known social media that we have. And it's very hard to make people believe what they don't want to believe, saying that it's the marker that it's fake news or it's not true that is the problem and not the content. And I think that's why it is important for newsrooms, when reporting on misinformation or disinformation, to take their audience through the process of how they know it's disinformation or misinformation, because that builds trust. When you just put out a story and say, this is flagged, or this is not true, or we think this is disinformation, and without telling them how you know it's disinformation or misinformation, then you're not really doing your job as a journalist. Ultimately what you want is for your audience or your reader to know why you think it's disinformation, how you think it's disinformation, and what they need to know to be able to spot when it is disinformation. And I feel social media platforms can do that too. We think this is disinformation because the content contains so and so and so. And like for me and my team, what we do is take our audience through the process, the tools that we used, how we spotted this, it is disinformation in the first place, or why we think it was disinformation, and then what we did to prove that it's disinformation. I think that we'll be able to, by doing that, we'll be able to regain the lost trust.
Yeah, but you're also depending on the public to choose to sit still for spinach when they're offered candy.
Yeah.
And I wonder about that, because candy is so much more appealing. I try to be idealistic about this stuff. I mean, just being a reporter for 40 years is an exercise in idealism in a lot of ways. What I saw, for instance, during the social disturbance across the country after the killing of George Floyd, I saw astonishing things that, even though I'm kind of jaded and I feel like I've seen it all, it scared me and intrigued me. I went down to the demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and spent a lot of time on the streets. And the street lamps in the nation's capital are filled with a gas to more brightly light the street. But when you photograph it from above, it looks like the streets are on fire. And some social media influencer posted a picture of downtown Washington, D.C., where I had literally been 20 minutes before, and said, your nation's capital is burning. And I looked at it and I thought, well, okay, do I wade into this and say, I was just there, it's not, that's those argon gas streetlights, don't worry, Washington's not on fire? Or do I just forget it and realize that the people who want to believe that, the people who want to believe that their fellow citizens are burning down the nation's capital are not going to believe me. They're just going to say, oh, you're another deceiving, lying, biased, mistrusted member of the press. But as an exercise, I would go in and say, just back from there, nothing's on fire, that's
Yeah.
the color of our streetlights, and wait for the deluge of angry, unhinged messaging of people saying, it's not true, you're covering up, there's fires all over Washington. And it was a reminder of just how hard and how long this battle is going to be.
Absolutely.
It's like an arms race because they get better when the good guys get better.
Oh, yes, they do.
Do you have as much money as the laboratories funded by various countries to keep the heat on in places around the world? I guess you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like sometimes I would say we need to put in, we as journalists, as fact checkers, we need to put in as much energy in debunking and fact checking misinformation as is put in spreading it, but it can't be done. I don't think it's something that is doable, because the energy and the resources and, of course, the motivation out there for them is huge compared to what we have to do. Because as journalists, we don't just sit and report on misinformation, disinformation. Well, except for people like me, who that's all we do. But then for other journalists who have to report on other things, who have to investigate other things, it's not doable. And that's putting a lot of strain in newsrooms, and editors are complaining that the plethora of misinformation and disinformation that they see is taking away their very good journalists that would be doing something else rather than reporting on misinformation and disinformation. And that's why I say I'm not optimistic about the situation.
And yet you're a senior journalist in the disinformation unit, so you're probably an idealist too. I'm busting Fauziyya. I'm exposing you as an idealist as well. Because that's why we do this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's for the health of a society
Yeah.
that it gets good information. It could be bad news, it could be good news, but a society can't be healthy if it believes lies.
Absolutely. And believe it or not, disinformation kills people. It harms people. It destroys societies and communities. And that's why we have to keep reporting it.
In the United States, we have a situation where newsrooms are shrinking. There's more content than ever. There's more stuff than ever, and there's fewer people making it every year. There are fewer people working full-time as reporters in the United States than there were 25 years ago. And yet, there's just an unimaginable amount more stuff. Mm-hmm. That doesn't tell me anything good about how much work and how much thought is going into preparing and distributing the things we make. Maybe that's a rant for another day, but it does mean that the army of disinformation, with its troops and its generals, is as well armed and well trained as the army of information. And that is a disturbing state of affairs. The business is not as profitable as it used to be, so institutions cut staff to try to balance the books. Mm-hmm. And it has also the effect of reducing trust in what we're putting out.
Absolutely.
Is that the case in Nigeria as well? If the government announces a harvest, a set of school results, forecasts about next year and possibilities for economic growth, is there still a deposit of social trust, or has there ever been a deposit of social trust, where the average Nigerian will say, okay, I'll take this at face value. I will believe the government. Or is suspicion rising, even when it's not warranted?
Yeah, suspicion is rising. There is complete distrust in the government. Nigeria is a country that is dealing with a lot of things: insecurity, inflation, poor infrastructure, poor economic choices, policies, so many things. And, you know, it's just been very hard for a lot of Nigerians in the past years. And like I said, we're a very new democracy. And your average Nigerian would tell you, I have not benefited anything, from democracy. We just got, not just, but we got out of a military rule in 1999. So it's about 25, 26 years now, but we don't really have much to show. And that has led to so much distrust of the government. And this election, we were hoping that, things would be a little bit different with the electoral process, and that it would be a new dawn for us in the country. But I don't think we achieved that. And then you put that and you bring the whole fake news, false information peddling, disinformation campaigns from the political parties themselves. There's no trust in the government, no.
Does that rising lack of trust also infect other institutions? The news media, the church, the mosque, the court system, the university system. When trust in institutions is waning, does that make our job harder and the disinformation peddler's job easier?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's just the answer. Yes. It's systematic, the lack of trust. It goes across everything: the government, the religious institutions, education, anything you can, military, the police, anything you can think of. It's not a very working situation, And yes, the disinformation peddlers realize this. And of course, it's to their advantage, and that's why it's easy for them to inject their ideas into the Nigerian public, and that's why it's easy for Nigerians to believe that.
So quick final thoughts before we go to our table conversations. What gives you hope, if anything?
In terms of?
In terms of the battle to have an informed public, which is necessary to have a functioning democracy.
What gives me hope, I think, is the fact that the media is beginning to realize that we have a responsibility, not beginning to realize, but the media knowing that we have a responsibility to present factual information. And by doing that, we also have a responsibility to see that our countries where we work, our different countries, that we put people first before any other thing, and that we stay true to what we believe in and do not give in to, I would say the negativities. For me, coming from a country where we do not rank very high in the Press Freedom Index, it's important to know what comes first as far as my job is concerned.
Fauziyya, thank you.
Thank you so much.
BBC senior journalist Fauziyya Tukur.